When you talk about elder law, one of the questions most people are concerned with is, what is Medicaid? Today, we're answering some of the most frequently asked questions about Medicaid and long-term care planning. I'm with Foster Swift attorneys Nick Camargo and Matt Fedor. Thank you both for being here to talk through this. Let's start off first with answering this question. What is Medicaid, and why do I care about this?
Yeah, Julie, Medicaid is sort of this unique, complex creature that's been devised federally and at the state level as a financial system to help certain people who are eligible with their long-term care planning. So if you think about it from that context, it's basically federal and state dollars that are getting paid to people to help them manage the expense of any long-term care housing needs that they may have or other care needs that they may have. What we get into in the elder law world is this idea of Medicaid planning. And that's the other question is, well, what's Medicaid planning then? Generally, what we think of as Medicaid planning is the creation of plans designed to save as many assets as possible for a variety of purposes, for spouses, for generational wealth, and really for anything else you can think of, to save as many assets as possible while also gaining eligibility for the Medicaid system in your state. And so what attorneys who specialize in this area of law do is they work with various providers and they work within the complex rules of Medicaid to try and basically save your stuff so that you can get as much assistance for that long-term care without having to spend all of your resources, money, or assets to provide for yourself. There's really no bad time to start talking about Medicaid planning. Matt, who does a lot of Medicaid planning along with myself, will get into the intricacies of when you have to do it in earnest, when you have to start filling out applications and really moving stuff around. But again, like we've stressed so often throughout many of these videos, starting that conversation earlier rather than later is a good thing. It's one of those things that people oftentimes come to us and say, gosh, I wish I would have known that a few years ago or 5 years ago. And the sooner you are knowledgeable about it, the sooner you understand what your options are, the sooner you've had a chance to speak with an attorney who specializes in this type of planning, and you can sort of plan out your own life for it, the better off you're going to be. That said, I'll tell you, it's never too late. Every dollar you can save, every asset you can preserve is a benefit to you and your family, your spouse, your children, etc. And so it's never too late. Even if you get at that point where, gosh, I'm going to go in right now and I need this type of assistance immediately, we can help. And that's what we really sort of are designed to do.
Yeah, Nick's right. I mean, we get that question a lot, even just with regular estate planning clients. You know, what is Medicaid, and should I be worried about it? Medicaid is simply put, it's a one manner of paying for long-term care. They've got different programs. They've got programs for remaining in your home. They've got programs if you're going into a long-term care facility. But effectively, what Medicaid is it's a way to pay for that long-term care. There's only a few ways that you can pay for long-term care if necessary. You can either private pay, you pay out of your savings and out of your pocket. You can pay through Medicaid if you are eligible for that. And then there's some other hybrid methods which would basically cover some of the costs, like long-term care insurance policies and things of that nature. But effectively, when we're talking about Medicaid, what we're trying to do is preserve as many of the assets of what we'll call the Medicaid spouse, the person going into the Medicaid facility, as possible. So just to give you an example, the common scenario that we see often is where one spouse can no longer care for a disabled spouse, and that disabled spouse has to go into a long-term care facility. So when that happens, the concern is that the couple will spend all of their assets on the Medicaid spouse, and the spouse who's not in the facility won't have enough to live on. And that's one of the biggest concerns and the biggest opportunities we see to do some Medicaid planning. And generally, the way we do it is you have to have certain financial requirements met, both at an income level and at an asset level. And so what we try to do is convert what they call countable assets into non-countable assets. And everybody has both. And without going into all the great details, if you convert countable assets into non-countable assets, then you can preserve some of the assets for the remaining spouse to live on and still live outside in the community.
So, Nick, you mentioned that it's never too late to start the planning process. But Matt, I'd like to hear, when ideally should we start planning for Medicaid?
That's a good question, Julie. There's really, well, first of all, I should say that the conversation that you should have the conversation as early as possible with a qualified attorney to have the discussion of things that you should be concerned with. But there's really two prime opportunities to start planning for Medicaid. One is 5 years before you need it. Medicaid has a 5-year look back period, so any transfers or any disposition of assets you do will be counted if it's within 5 years of the individual entering the nursing home. We call that the pre-planning. That's really when people say, look, I've been diagnosed with a long-term illness. I've got X amount of dollars that I can last until Y, and therefore I know at the 5-year mark, I'm going to need to be able to be eligible for Medicaid. So that's early, the 5-year rule, and that's one portion of the planning. The other more common planning, frankly, is what we call the emergency planning. When we get a call from a family member and they just received a letter saying that Medicare was going to run out and is going to stop paying for the care of the individual, next Tuesday. Then we go into what they call emergency planning. And at that time, then we start trying to convert those countable assets into the non-countable assets. And how people say, how long can this go on, or how long does it take? If, from the word go, when am I going to be eligible? And it varies. A lot of it is dependent on the client. There's a significant amount of documentation that's required. So, digging that out is usually the biggest hurdle. So by the time you get the documents researched and dug out into the attorney, and the application is made and all of the information is filled out, you can look at 30, 60, 90 days before you actually get the application submitted. The good news is that Medicaid will go back 3 months prior to, as long as you were eligible before, from the date of the application. They can pay up to 3 months as long as you were eligible of Medicaid expenses. So there are some things that you can manipulate a little bit in order to maximize the value. But the short answer is you can there's the early planning and then there's the emergency planning. But having the conversation with a qualified attorney as soon as you can is always recommended.
And Julie, if I can interject and sort of add on to what Matt has said, one of the things that people don't realize about Medicaid planning is that often it requires you to give up control over your assets, or what we as attorneys say, give up control. That's one of the ways you protect these assets, is by giving up control. And so having that conversation early is really important, but exactly when to put into place a plan and to start moving assets around and to start doing some of the planning techniques that we have at our disposal will really depend on a variety of factors. Like Matt mentioned earlier, what's the potential or possibility for me needing long-term care planning in the near future? Another one of the factors may be, how many assets do we have? Do we have a great amount of assets that we're never going to need to use, even if we live to 120? Can we already start planning on some of those? And there's no right answer to how to go about it, or when to exactly start. But that's why Matt and I, stress so often having that conversation first, because then we can start to hone in a little better on, okay, what are our health needs? What are our long-term needs? What are our asset needs? And then we can make the decision on when to let go of certain control over certain assets in order to make us eligible for Medicaid.
And Julie, you mentioned at the beginning, the idea of frequently asked questions. So just briefly, I want to run through a few things that we get commonly that clients ask about. One is do I have to give up my home? And the answer to that is typically no. I'm going to give you the general rule. There's always exceptions to the rule, but generally a home is an exempt asset as long as it's titled properly. And so you don't have to give up the family home or the family farm just to go on Medicaid? That's one of the questions we get quite frequently. Another one is can I protect all of my assets? And the short answer to that is no. Medicaid doesn't protect all of your assets, but it allows you to protect the most assets under the law. So Medicaid will still cost you, if you do the emergency Medicaid planning, that will still cost you some of your assets in the spend down process and the cost of paying an attorney to help you with that. You will dissipate some of the assets, but you are preserving as many of the assets as you possibly can. So while it's not free, it is helpful. And again, we go back to that community spouse example that I gave you before, which is one spouse goes into the nursing facility, but the other spouse who's staying in the community still needs the ability to pay and live and provide for themselves. One more question that we get quite a bit is whether or not, or how does Medicaid work together with veterans benefits and some of these other things, the income that the individuals are getting, and the short answer to that is that it depends, right? So there's mathematical formulas and there's limits as to income and how much you can get, and sometimes the community spouse can receive some of the Medicaid spouse's income. But the answer is if you're concerned, one of the analysis we do during that process is to make sure that the community spouse, if we do all the planning and we do the conversion of the assets, is the community spouse going to have enough to continue to live on? That's very important. So by becoming eligible for Medicaid for the Medicaid spouse, we want to make sure that the community spouse still is taken care of. So those are some of the general questions we get, pretty common, that I just wanted to let people know about.
Matt and Nick, thank you for your insights on this topic. For more on elder law planning and specifically on Medicaid planning, head to Foster Swift's blog, myelderlawblog.com.